So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I want to thank you, Jazakallah al-Khair, for inviting me and for allowing me to participate in this conversation. In the late 90s, there was a huge movement around South Africa, right? And basically like the end of apartheid, free Nelson Mandela. And it was this, if you're not familiar with it, you should be, you gotta learn about it, right? It was like this huge movement. And it became a movement that was almost like infiltrated into every sector. You found it on college campuses, you found it, you found like young people, it's particularly young people on college campuses in America were a huge like influence in terms of this movement. So you found it in art, you found it, like it just began to infiltrate everywhere. Like this kind of in apartheid, free Nelson Mandela, and then subhanAllah, Nelson Mandela became free. Fast forward a few years later, or actually not long from that, at that time I'm actually a very, very, very young student. I wasn't in college yet. And I ended up basically working with an organization from South Africa. And one of the things that I learned is that even though the apartheid had ended in South Africa, there was this huge divide, like cultural divide, between the Muslims of South Africa and basically, let's just say, the indigenous population of South Africa. And so I was like, well, why is that? I'm thinking like, because when it came to America, the Muslims were so involved in terms of like in apartheid and free, and a lot of it had to do with the Muslim population had pretty much decided like we're going to stay out of it in South Africa, right? For those who were in a certain economic background or a certain economic bracket, for those who had certain cultural ties even to other lands, they kind of felt like, you know what, this is not a Muslim issue, right? Like this is just a social, political issue. And for the most part, there was, the Muslims said, well, as long as the South African government is not keeping us from making salah, they're not keeping us from praying, then, we don't have much to say. Which of course just enraged me on a number of issues, because like Muslims have a tons of things to say as it relates to social justice and their concern, even if you it's that our concern doesn't end at the borders of our Muslim community, right? And it's, so that we fast forward to today, alhamdulillah, 30 plus years later, and when we look at the movement specifically around Palestine, right? And you get to see, I actually find it extremely heartwarming to see how Muslims came across, right, what we would consider some of the boundaries of faith, even the boundaries as it relates to certain philosophical issues across, economic backgrounds, and begin to not only just educate, but begin to organize, subhanAllah, around issues related to Palestine. So you have those who are, whether they're Muslim, they're Christian, whether they're Jews for peace, those who are even, I even see what we consider some of the Hasidic Jews or Orthodox Jews who don't actually ascribe to Zionism, are very much, they've been, mashallah, tabarak rahman, many of them have actually been connected to the Muslim community since the Iraqi war, right? Saying, well, these are our beliefs and we actually stand with you. So to see how Muslims, as a result of that, moving beyond the boundaries of what we would consider our own individual interest and saying, no, this is a humanitarian issue, then it became something that allowed for humanity to be able to develop, and to be honest, not just for America, but literally across the globe. As you've seen the rallies and you've seen the movement spread, right, far beyond the Muslim community. And that has to do with the fact that, subhanAllah, the Muslim community was actually willing to share ideas, to share space, to share platforms with other people around that issue, right? And begin to address it, that this is not just our issue, this belongs to all of us. And so what you have in both of those situations that I mentioned is you have this opportunity, right? There's like a challenge. You can have an opportunity missed, or you can have an opportunity that's grasped and actually formed into something. Now that comes with challenges. One of the biggest challenges, for example, in 2017, I took a trip. It was, 2017 was the first time I actually visited Palestine. And I'm using this as an example because, of course, yes, it's something that's hot on our tongues and topics right now, but it's something it's very present with us right now. So in 2017, I took my first trip to Palestine, and I went with an organization which, I want to see how I want to frame this. They were framed as an interfaith group. We'll put it like that. They were framed as an interfaith group. So there were I think there were only two of us who were Muslim. Yeah, I think there were two or three Muslims. Three Muslims, sorry. There were some Muslims who were on the trip. And then some Christians and some other folks identifying into other faith groups or no faith. Long story short, what I began to see very quickly is that the issue of Palestine was addressed, of course, from the perspective of refugees, from the perspective of humanitarian aid. But what I also began to see that was extremely challenging and very scary was the beginning of the deep grip that I would say certain liberals or leftist movement have inside the Muslim psyche, right? Because there were certain things that I was like, wait a minute, how are we expecting victory over Masjid al-Aqsa, over Philistine, while adopting certain ideology and even not just a certain ideology, but a certain lifestyle that clearly our deen draws a line in the sand. And I don't think I need to detail that right on camera. I think most of you understand what I'm saying. Like within the social justice movement, that it's actually within the framework of Free Palestine, the pro-Palestinian movement, that we begin to see some of the cracks that existed in the Muslim community as it relates to our understanding of social justice and social activism. And where do we define the lines? And so inside, of course, of being with other Muslims who are involved with social activism, then being on campus and working with students, at that time I was working at NYU, I begin to see like, wow, we have adopted something. We've gone like gung-ho because there is a principle about social justice, but we're not practicing social justice from the perspective of Islam. We're actually addressing social justice from someone else's framework, right? And then in addition to, in that moment, we almost gave up the platform, like the Palestinian platform as it relates to Masjid al-Aqsa became just a platform let's say, for something else. And so instead of the Muslims kind of being the leader on that platform, the head of the horse, we actually were on the back. And a lot of that had to do with, there were some very fundamental basic things about our aqidah that we just didn't know. Right? And so there were some fundamental things about our understanding about how do you build something, like even in terms of fiqh, like in terms of how do you build and how do you organize and how do you work, not just with people of other faiths, but how do you build solidarity with them without us either becoming extremely compromised or giving up our values altogether, saying, well, it's okay because we're standing for a greater good. Right? What are the principles by which that we believe actually grant us that victory, that give us fathan mubina, right? That give us a clear and manifest victory? There are some conditions for that, right? As it relates to our position. So I raise the question for all of us, who are committed to any cause, right? Is one thing. Number one, jazakallah khair, is that we first and foremost must have, like, alhamdulillah, shukrillah, many campuses now have Muslim chaplains. They have someone who is teaching classes and things like that. But are we committed, right? Like to the deeper core. Like, are we committed to social justice because it's trending, because it's like it's the right thing to do? Or are we committed to it from the perspective of, I wish to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and follow in the way of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and to be exactly who Allah created me to be, which was the Khalifa of the earth. And so yes, that means I don't just take care of the Muslims, but the way I do it. So the reality is, we might be fighting against the same thing, but we may not always be fighting for the same thing, right? Making our methodology a little bit different, right, than what we consider the general public. But if we don't know it, you can't implement something, you can't be the leader of something that we ourselves don't know the details about. Lastly, I want to say this. The reason why I consider the situation in South Africa a huge opportunity lost is because what you found inside of South Africa, particularly within poorer communities, is something very similar to the African American communities, let's say in the South, or in some of, even in the South side of Chicago, is that there was actually not only a need for Islam in their community, for Islam to be presented as a healing balm, but they actually were hungry for Islam. But because of our cultural, or not willing to say, well, they're not Muslim, we're not going to work with them, then the opportunity for that dawah was lost. In both cases, you have folks who are like, we're trying to be Muslim, we're trying to hold on, but we're not very guided about how to engage, right? Or when we should engage, or how we should engage. And so I say for us that there's an opportunity for us right now. We're seeing, mashallah, tabarak rahman, the amount of people who are taking shahada, right? The amount of people who are like, I'm reading Quran for the first time, right? Like I want to know what Muslims have to say about this. I'm interested just from what they're witnessing, subhanallah, on television. My thing is, how are we galvanizing on campus to present ourselves, to present Islam as a viable solution to the challenges of humanity? So that when we do sit with people of other faiths or people of no faith, that we're speaking and representing Islam in a manner like, this is the healing, the guidance, and the light for humanity, right? Like, this is it. A lot of times I don't want to name the organizations, but a lot of organizations we went to, right? We drank a lot of tea, we had a lot of breakfast, right? We did a lot of like very surface interfaith work, right? Very general, so that we could take the picture and we could say that we were sisters of faith, right? But there were certain issues that we could just not talk about, which for me says, this sisterhood, this solidarity is fake. If we can disagree. We can disagree. But I know my position, and I can present it in an eloquent, right, beautiful, loving way, saying that this is the stance that I hold on to. Right? And this is at least where I reach my hand across the table and say I offer it. Either that we can stand together in solidarity but having difference of opinion, or we stand in solidarity on the same page. But I find a lot of times inside of interfaith spaces, the Muslims are like, we're smiling and we're taking pictures and we're going along to get along. And it's just because we don't know who we are and what role we're supposed to play. And so with that being said, I pose the challenge for us is, how will we use the opportunity that's been presented to us right now? Jazakumullah khair.
Q&A at the end, inshallah.
السلام عليكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أفضل الخلق وسيد المرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, Surah Yunus, that ولو شاء ربك لآمن من في الأرض كلهم جميعا أفأنت تكره الناس حتى يكونوا مؤمنين. And I start with this ayah because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, if your Lord wanted, everyone, each and every single person, and there's an emphasis here, each and every single person in this world could have been guided. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala he says, أَفَأَنْتَ تُكْرِهُ النَّاسِ حَتَّى يَكُونُوا مُؤْمِنِينَ. Will you force people to be Muslims? Is that the way you're going to go about this? And so I start with this ayah from the perspective of, we have in the Quran very, 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 very clear guidance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in numerous places gives us this concept, Al-haqqu min rabbika. فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. That truth is from your Lord. Whoever wants will believe and whoever wants will disbelieve. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gives us the greatest verse in the Quran, which is what? What's the greatest verse in the Quran? Ayatul Kursi. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. A description that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives of Himself. What's the next ayah? La ikraha fi din. It's very telling that there is no compulsion in religion. And so I share these verses, so as if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that, look, this is who I am, but it's up to people to believe. It's up to people to believe. And we're comfortable with that as Muslims. And so I kind of start off with this for the purpose of sharing that, on campus, we have to get more comfortable in the space of interreligious dialogue with the fact that, yes, our mandate is to give da'wah, but da'wah has different angles and ways. One form of da'wah is direct da'wah. You have your da'wah table and your da'wah pamphlets, and Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the truth, and he's the last prophet, and this is Jesus in the Quran, and this is truly who Jesus, and all of these things, right? You have your Why Islam material, you have all your stuff. And you're there and you're conveying the message clear. But another strain of that is that you engage in just open dialogue with people about who you are. There's a certain openness that you have about others as to who they are. We know very clear who we are. We know that we stand on truth. Inna dina inda Allah al-Islam. Right? And we're comfortable with that. But it should not be something that precludes us from engaging with other people. Now let me tell you why. We need to be more active in this space, particularly on campus. Because look, this is what happens. If we don't occupy those spaces, then we end up being the one that's invited. Like Sheikh Aisha was just mentioning, there's other groups that who call us to the table and dictate the agenda and frame things in the way they want to frame them, and then we're stuck in a framework that's not our framework. There was an event recently at one of the universities that I was a chaplain at. Actually, I'll say what it is, UCLA, right? And there was a panel that was held. It was an external organization. It wasn't a Muslim organization that hosted a panel on what was it? It was something to the effect of, is Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam the last and final messenger, and is salvation for a Muslim premised on belief in him as being the last and final messenger? As if there's some other variation of that. And then this external organization brought a character, I'll say, who has very, very, I'll call it for what it is, deviant views in terms of what Islam is. And they're presenting on one side, and then there's somebody else who's debating on the other side, somebody who's well respected in the Muslim community. But as if there's two different narratives in the Muslim community. There's no two different narratives. We have a very clear narrative. Why did that happen? Because we as Muslims, we're not at the forefront. We're not guiding discussions. We're rather reacting. Rather, we are, letting ourselves being pulled into other people's agendas. And that was done intentional. And I confronted the individuals who organize this. We don't do things this way. We don't debate these things in the Muslim community. We don't have these sort of discussions. We don't debate. We talk about, we have dialogue, But we don't debate fundamentals of our faith and so forth. So my point is what? My point is that, look, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us very clearly in the Quran that if He wanted to, He would have guided everyone. But He didn't. And we're comfortable with that. And that means that we're comfortable with people of other faiths being next to them, sitting and having dialogue with them, talking to them about their worldviews and so on and so forth. Now, our eye is always on da'wah. Our eye is always on portraying the truth. And trust me, anytime you have a panel, and this has happened dozens of times in my life, you're invited to some interfaith panel of some sort, and they give you some topic to discuss, and there's a Jewish rabbi, a Catholic priest, maybe a Baptist minister, and then me as a Muslim imam, for example. And they give you some subject matter to talk about, the shared talk about your understanding of who Abraham was, for example, Sayyidina Ibrahim alayhi salam, or whatever other topic. The discussion that ensues as it relates to any given religious topic in those settings, Islam is always so clear. It's always so manifest. The message is so straight. It's so undeniable. And the audience who may consist of people from different walks of life and different backgrounds and all of these things, they hear that clarity. It speaks for itself, right? So I say that to say that we should not be afraid of engaging in those spaces. And then this is the other thing. This is the benefit, right? This is the benefit that happens at the time of crisis. We have taken leadership roles in that space, in the community, on campus. And when crisis happens, as a massive crisis is unfolding in front of our eyes right now in Palestine, then we have the ability to call our allies to the table and frame things in the way we want to frame them and have them stand with us because we have a pre-existing relationship with them and they understand who we are. We're not being asked to compromise who we are. Excuse me. Alhamdulillah. So we're not asked to compromise who we are because we are the ones who are carrying that flag of calling people together. And so I say all of this to say that, look, there's a lot of hesitancy for Muslims in engaging in interreligious dialogue and debate and so forth. And I understand that partly. Now, it's not for everyone. Someone needs to be firm in their understanding of the deen. Someone needs to know what Islam says about XYZ before you put yourself in a scenario where concepts are going to be thrown at you. They have certain theological sort of frameworks that they work by that they may be very strongly grounded in. And then when you're hit with those and you don't even understand what Islam says about XYZ, then it puts you in a big conundrum, right? So I'm not advising this for people, but for those who have a good understanding of your faith, of your deen, put yourself in those spaces, because there's one other consequence of us not putting ourselves in those spaces. Because, and this is in the general Muslim community, and I imagine it applies to campus as well, is that when people who are of grounded faith, right, who understand their deen, occupy these spaces in interreligious dialogue in the community, there's no room for these characters who claim to represent Islam to step in those spaces, because this is what happens, and very often, imams are very hesitant. Many imams are hesitant to step into these spaces because, sometimes it is a little funny, man, like dealing with people and the way in which they engage. You do have to be conscious. Everybody wants to hug you, of people of the opposite. So people just like withdraw altogether. learning how to hold true to your principles, learning how to be very clear in terms of how you present, how you engage, what you're going to talk about. It's not kumbaya, my Lord. We're not going to hold hands. I'm not going to sit and hold your hands at the end of the session and go into, some prayer by some person that, doesn't, and all of these, you do come into these sort of spaces where you have to navigate, and you have to navigate with grace, but with also firmness. Now, what happens is, so people of knowledge sometimes hesitate from engaging in those spaces, and then what happens? People who don't have knowledge, who claim to represent Islam, step in those spaces, right? And they come of all different colors, and I'm talking about, beyond white, black, and brown, other colors, who start representing what we stand for, and that's very dangerous for us, because then they become the go-tos, right, in these communities. They become people who represent Islam in those spaces, and we don't have a clear, true voice. That when we have that clear, true voice, even though we're not engaged in some sort of direct da'wah where we are actually, ud'u ila sabili rabbika bil hikmati wal maw'izati al hasana. We're not preaching in this way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prescribes to us with wisdom and good preaching in a more direct manner, although that has different forms even in and of itself. It's not that, but it's a different strain, and that other strain is very important. It's important that we become prepped, and we become we become ready to engage in those spaces, so that we can affect dialogue in a positive way. We can call people to the deen, we can call people to the truth in a way where people of intellect will understand what I say versus what that other person says and that other person says, and will be able to see the truth, because the truth is clear, the truth is beautiful, the truth is light, and it shows for itself. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help us to be voices of truth wherever we go. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad.
Jazakallah khair for those great insightful discussions and value points for us. So we have a couple of questions that came in. And I think the first one is definitely relatable for my own college experience at the University of Illinois. So we've had experiences on campus where religious groups have an agenda to portray Muslims in a negative light. Administration oftentimes turns a blind eye to any discrimination towards Muslims. Do we still look for interfaith dialogue despite two-facedness from religious groups and false promises by administration?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. Let me see something.
Bismillah. So I've seen this, right? What that question is kind of portraying. I've seen this. We have to be astute. We have to be aware. We have to be conscious of different groups that are out there, and what they stand for, and the angle that they're coming from. Now, those, what was kind of mentioned here, oftentimes those things are done intentionally, because they recognize that, okay, we can catch these naive Muslim students, right? Bring them into the space, get them tongue twisted, get them in this awkward sort of places and spaces. When you have these sort of opportunities present themselves, I'm not saying that we shouldn't engage, but how we engage is very, very important. Number one, consult with senior folks in the community, right? If you have a chaplain at school, definitely with them. If you have, you want to make sure you have solid connections with your imam, with the leadership in the community, so you know who is calling you to the table. Oftentimes we don't understand who they are and their agenda, but others in the community do, right? Because they've been, these other groups and the agendas that they come with, they've presented themselves in other places and spaces in the community. So make sure you consult, right? Don't be so brash and so bold to think that everybody's out, everybody who's out there, and that we're just going to take this head on, and they're not, trust me, there's a lot more sophistication in some of these other groups than we have, because we just haven't engaged in the way in which they have for decades and decades, right? So know who you're dealing with. That's the point. Know who you're dealing with, so you don't find yourself, you don't end up in those sort of compromise positions. Really, really, really important. Now, once you do that, should you still engage? Yes, sir, it depends, right? If there's people who understand how they work and how they function and where they're coming from, you can have dialogue with those groups before you get up on stage where you now have to be confronted with whatever. And you help frame how that dialogue is going to look, because you understand where they're coming from. So you go to them and say, hey, we'd like to run it this way. Rather than just sitting at the plate and you're being served whatever dish you're being served, and you didn't have a hand in cooking it. You understand what I'm saying? So being conscious of how you engage is really, really important.
But those who are able to understand or to learn about having discourse, right? In how to navigate difficult situations. For example, a room that has been invited in order to, present Islam in a negative light, you actually, if that person is skilled, as well as they have backup, meaning that they've come with certain community leaders, certain elders in the community, people who've been doing work in the community for a while, you make sure that they're with you. But if you have that ability, or you've been trained in that skill, to be able to turn something that intentionally was meant in order to misrepresent Islam, that's a wonderful opportunity, that now you've got a captive audience to be able to teach them the truth about Islam, right? So those are the moments, like Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu ta'ala an, when he's, his initial intent is to come murder the Prophet sallallahu wasallam, right? His intent is like, I'm coming to put an end to this message. And subhanAllah, his heart is turned around. And so, but that requires some adhkar, some skills, and some elders who've been knee deep in community work to have your back.
So our next question is about a certain verse in the Quran. So it's in the context of interfaith. How do you interpret the ayah in Surah Nisa, verse 144, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "O you who have believed, do not take the disbelievers as allies instead of the believers. Do you wish to give Allah against yourselves a clear case?" So any insight on that, inshallah.
Okay, bismillah. So in this case of speaking about taking them as awliya, that's mentioned in this verse, there are a couple things. The first one is about in terms of in the concept of marriage, right? Like who can represent a woman in this moment of marriage? Who's going to represent her rights, make sure she gets them, things like that. So this is one particular, and I say that to say, so meaning that even in the case that you have somebody who's a mentor, but they only have they can only go to a certain line. When it comes to, and this is not just in the case of marriage, but when it comes to maintaining your rights as a Muslim, to think that you're going to get all of those rights, or all those rights are going to be represented by someone who doesn't actually fully understand them all, doesn't put you in the best light, and it's not permissible. So that would be one of the biggest aspects, right? That as it relates to this person is going to help me, in this personal capacity, represent me in a way to pursue some of my rights. Make sense? Now, as it relates to other ways, there are certain aspects, again, like we talked about, there's certain rules of engagement, right? Like when we talk about allies, again, under that definition of who are our allies, what is our allyship? For example, if this is, perfect, we have to be able to see shaitan from far, meaning we're in a situation today as Muslims where there are certain people who are standing with us for Palestine. If they say, okay, now you stand with me, right, in this pride rally, I can't do that. That's actually the line that I cannot assist you. We have certain, I'll give you, in the case of Prophet Lut, alayhi salam, where we all know the story, and I'm just giving this as an exact example where literally his wife, she was an ally. That's what she was. right? He and his daughters were of the righteous. They were, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told them, okay, listen, this is what's going to happen. This is what I'm going to do. Your job is your job right now. You've done your job. You've delivered the message. You've done the best you can. Now I'm instructing you to leave and not look back. So upon their arrival, she was someone who hung out with them. She was someone who hung out with them. She was someone who actually had conversation with them. She actually warned them, this is what's going to happen. When the three angels actually entered into the city, she was like, I know you see them, meaning you see they're cute. She was in a friendship with them. What happened to her? She was an ally. So Allah Azza wa Jalla is saying, listen, in this concept of allyship, our contracts and our covenants and our agreements, right, are based upon that my deen is not compromised in those situations. So if we come together to assist each other in something, then we come together from I don't compromise my Islamic position in order for us to do that. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
I'll just add one thing to that, and that the criteria is وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى, right? When do we cooperate? It doesn't mean that we don't cooperate with other people in various causes, social justice, call for social justice as it relates to different things. But what's the criteria? Bir wa taqwa, things that are grounded in righteousness. What does that mean? Things that Islam approves, things that Islam sees in a positive light, things that Islam considers good. We're happy to work with anybody. Right? We're happy to metaphorically hold hands with anybody to promote some common good in society. And we have plenty of examples of Rasulullah ﷺ doing that. Before he became a prophet, after he became a prophet. And taqwa, and anything that's, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He is watching us do what we do, He's pleased with what we're doing. Though that's the criteria. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. But don't cooperate with others in things that are sinful and things that are grounded in enmity, aggression, and so forth.
So I think this next question is to do with having ihsan in debate. So how do you portray the true viewpoints of Islam in a debate without worrying of offending others or burning bridges with other faiths on campus? I think especially when some of the talking points, directly might contradict with some of their integral beliefs.
It's Muslims, may Allah bless us, are so polite. We're taught to be so polite, right? And so in our politeness, we're always concerned about offending someone. But Allah is more worthy for us not to offend. And so in those situations, we can present, I'll give you a perfect example. There was an ambassador who came to visit, there was a delegation of, let's just say, the, important folks of the world in California. And so if you can imagine some of the ambassadors, as well as there was a king, and all on the Muslim side, right? And then there were some others from other places who were coming that were a part of the delegation. And so there was a woman who had, as they were walking through the line, she reached one of the Muslim ambassador. I don't want to call him out. So she went to shake his hand. And as she went to shake his hand, he said, "Forgive me. I promised God and my wife I would never touch another woman." Right? She turned and smacked her husband and said, "Why do you promise me that?" Right? And it became a funny moment, and they joked and they laughed. But it was a very beautiful way of addressing, unfortunately, I'm not going to shake your hand, right? And it's so funny because even in those moments during COVID, everybody was like, we all got an excuse. I'm not shaking your hand, and I feel, you know what I mean? And I just don't feel any way about that. But subhanAllah, we don't have to wait for something like that to say, this is something I don't engage in. Forgive me, but for religious reasons. I don't shake hands with men. I'm committed to only touching my number one fan. Right? So there are ways that you can, whether it be with humor or with lightness. The other thing is that other people are not afraid to talk about their beliefs and to be firm about them, and it's okay. We can this is what Islam says about that. This is what we believe about that. This is what the Quran and our messenger said about that. I'm a convert. I converted to Islam as a teenager. And, I can think about Many times, like as a Christian, there are certain things that we were taught. I grew up in a very religious family. That was a studious religious family. And so it's not so much that I'm speaking to not offend you, as opposed to if I'm asked a question or I'm meant to represent my position, I represent that position. And I'm just representing this position. You can agree or not agree. You can take it or you don't take it. Right? There, like, lakum dinukum waliya din. Right? It's there, you can take it or you cannot take it. And so this, when I say that, because being Muslim, I'm like, mashallah, these people are so polite. They're like really concerned about the opinions of other people and whether or not you offend them in representing your belief. But alhamdulillah wa shukrillah that somebody has to stand up and just speak very truthfully and very eloquently about what does Islam say about it. Because it actually gives the opportunity for other people to have certain questions or actually to have clarity about their own faith. But if we're too shy to represent it, then who will tell us the truth? Like I can remember the first time I heard someone just say very bluntly that in Islam, that Jesus is a prophet, and that's in describe what is the status of a prophet. It's not, you cannot, it's not something that you can be taught. It's someone that is selected, that is chosen, but understanding that the creator is the creator, and that he cannot be compared to the creation, that creation is something altogether different. I remember being like, wait a minute. So then I was like, I need a clarification. Then what do you, tell me how do you understand if he's the creation and that's the creator? It made me ask questions about the Trinity. In the end, I became Muslim because somebody was willing just to say very clearly, this is what we believe. There are a number of other stories I can think about that people need the truth and somebody who's willing to represent it. Don't worry about offending people. I mean, just don't be rude. Don't say, we can represent our faith without insulting other people. I can say, Islam says this, without saying, these ignorant such and such people, right? They're ridiculous in this. We can simply say, this is where Islam differs. This is where we agree, but this is the line actually where Islam represents something different. For example, even in the concept of, Jesus Christ is not the Son of God, what we can say is that we believe that Allah is more powerful, more great than not only a human being, but even having human experiences. Right? That's the definition of him being omnipotent, omniscient. When we say that he's just simply saying, I don't have to say that God didn't die. I can tell you by the definition of God saying that he's everlasting, that he never dies. I don't have to say, isn't that silly? You believe that it's silly. You believe that your God died on a cross. I don't have to say that. I can say, well, we all agree that God is everlasting. So since we all agree that God is everlasting, and the Islamic understanding is that death is impossible for him. Earthly experience of death are impossible for the Almighty.
I'll share one other just piece to what Sheikh Aisha mentioned, and Gina touched on it, that a turning point for many of us in our lives, I know one that was for me, is when I started really fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the way in which he needed to be feared, and not putting that fear that is owed to him amongst everyone else, right? And just that change, of course, that takes some growth, that takes some grounding, that takes some spiritual regimen, but that's a goal you want to have. I'm going to share a really weird, marker for you, but this is something. The image of it perhaps will resonate. When you're in the bathroom and you're making wudu in the sink, your foot is in the sink, right? And you're looking around. Right? You're worried about who's going to walk in because maybe you didn't have your socks on, maybe you're wearing your chappals or shib or sandals that day, right? Now, oh man, I got to wash my feet. That dude just walked out. Let me get in there, right? That happens to me too, by the way. Don't think, that my iman is like a mountain and I'm still, it's weird. Your foot is in the sink. That's weird, right? Regardless. But what happens? This happened to me so many times. Those thoughts come in my mind, Some dude comes in the bathroom, he goes and uses the bathroom, and he goes straight out the door. That dirty dude doesn't even wash his hands. Like, I'm worried about me washing my feet, like purifying myself in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I'm about to go pray to Him, one of my 5 prayers in a day that keeps me on this track and keeps me connected to Him. And I'm worried about some dirty dude that, sorry to frame it like that, but you follow what I'm saying. It's a weird example, but that mindset, right? It's the mindset of being connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and putting Him first over being worried about what others are going to think about us. And sometimes we're so overly, there's a complex, there's an inferiority complex, there's a post-colonial sort of complex that some people have. There's all of these different things, a brown complex, black complex, these different things that we need to self-introspect about, because those are oftentimes barriers from helping us to come full scale in our deen.
Dr. Rani Awad had a moment of making wudu in the airport bathroom. And a woman was standing there, like, watching her, like, you know what I mean? And she's like, what are you going to do next? And she was just watching her. So finally, when she went to put her foot in the sink, she's like, that's it. That's enough. That's enough. So I was like, are you the police of the bathroom? But long story short, she said, how often do you wash your face? So she said, I wash my face like twice a day. She said, well, I'm Muslim, and we do this 5 times a day. So technically, if I wash my feet 5 times a day, and you wash it 2 times a day, my feet are cleaner than your face. It's okay.
SubhanAllah, I think it's so important, like, especially nowadays, to be like confident Muslims, especially for like college MSA settings. You know, people are out there, like a lot of their first interactions with Muslims are on college campuses, so it's really important for us. And I think this is a really motivating talk to just be confident Muslims on campus, and inshallah, you know, if you put in the effort, then the results are in Allah's hands, inshallah. So, Jazakallah khair to our speakers, Sheikh Aisha and Sheikh Suhail. You have a round of applause. So that does conclude our MSA, you know, college MSA speeches. We do have another session at 3:15 in the same room here. It's a special entertainment event with Mulla Muhammad and Davis. And then just another reminder again, you've heard it, you know, the buzz and the various talks. There is a March for Gaza on January 13th, so please try your best. You know, schedule, travel, do the logistics and planning with your friends, and try to make it out there, inshallah. But outside of that, you know, follow MSA National on Instagram, inshallah, and Jazakallah khair for coming.